removing the BS from third-party assessments, and pricing practices that fit the bill. That and the latest news and trends in the managed security space coming right up on Cyber for Hire.
Building bridges between managed security providers and their clients, it's the podcast where MSPs, vCISOs, and end users take a united stand against cybercrime. This is Cyber for Hire.
Struggling to monitor the growing threat landscape, pressure to reduce costs, security skill gaps, facing compliance issues? These issues can translate to operational, financial, regulatory, and reputational risks to your business. Checkpoint can help. Checkpoint combines an MSSP enablement program, cloud-delivered multi-tenant management, SOC platform, and superior threat intelligence capabilities to give MSSPs the confidence to grow profitably at a reduced risk. Checkpoint is 100% channel-driven. We partner to deliver the best security everywhere. Visit msspalert.com/checkpoint. All right, welcome friends to episode number 21 of Cyber for Hire. How's everybody doing today? I'm Bradley Barth with SC Media in New York, and joining me today 13 time zones away in Seoul, South Korea, is my co-host and partner in cybercrime, Ryan Morris, principal consultant with Morris Management Partners. Ryan, we were originally scheduled to tape this a different day, but then something pretty interesting happened when you were in nearby Tokyo, Japan, an earthquake, and I know that caused a little bit of interference with our show. First of all, did you sleep through the earthquake? I think it happened early in the morning. Did you know it was happening when it happened? Tell us your earthquake experience.
You know, I would have absolutely slept through the process, except for the presence and very effective implementation of Japan's early warning earthquake system. Every single device in the entire country, television, cell phone, smartwatch, anything that's connected to the internet or a public broadcasting resource makes an unbelievably loud and annoying noise right before there's about to be an earthquake. So we were actually staying, I think, about 7 or 8 miles away from where the epicenter was. So we basically got the notice at exactly the time that we started to feel the shaking. And the best way to describe it is it kind of felt exactly like riding on the subway train in Tokyo. You know, a little bit of wobbling back and forth, but nothing that would knock you off your feet. So I was awoken, panicked, freaked out, not that bad. And then it was absolutely impossible to go back to sleep after that. So, you know, it was an earthquake.
Interesting. I didn't know that there was all that preparation, all those warning systems involved. Always good to be prepared like that. Always a good lesson for cybersecurity. I remember one rare earthquake that I lived through where I was yelling at everybody in the house that an earthquake is happening, and somehow they were just all ignoring me and going through with their conversations, and then they apparently just thought I was joking or something. But meanwhile, all the glasses were clinking, and I'm like, does nobody take me seriously? Does no one listen to me? But anyway, that's my little earthquake story. Very interesting, Ryan, but we got to keep moving. So plenty to discuss today as always, but some news just can't wait, which is why we want to share with everyone what's top of mind today. So here's your headline. Industrial security firm Dragos recently reported an attempted extortion scheme in which adversaries accessed the company's SharePoint service and contract management system, but failed to breach its network or cybersecurity platform. According to Dragos, the malicious actors gained access by compromising the email address of a new sales employee before they even started the job, and then impersonated that employee during the employment onboarding process, which is conducted through the aforementioned SharePoint service and contract management system. Dragos credits its layered security controls, including its SIM system and contracted incident response and MDR services, for preventing an actual ransomware deployment also noting that it did not engage with the extortionists, even as they threatened to publish information that they had accessed and menacingly referenced companies' executives' family members. So Drago said it revealed the details behind this largely mitigated attack in order to destigmatize security events. So lots of interesting nuggets here to pounce on. Ryan, why is this top of mind for you?
I think the first thing that I thought of when this story came across was just how much incredibly detailed information is stored in almost easily accessible locations around everybody's network, right? If you think about the description that we're given here, that this was a largely mitigated attack specifically because of the layered approach to security that they've deployed. You can get through one tier, you won't get through the next tier. You'll only be able to access a certain amount of information. There's an all or nothing mentality, I think, in the media, especially, but also in kind of the layperson approach to cybersecurity these days. Either you are breached or you are not breached. It tends to be the way of thinking and describing these kinds of things. But what this company has experienced is that you don't need to be all the way breached in order to lose important data, in order for company secrets or otherwise very valuable information to be accessed and then misappropriated by the people who are doing the bad guy approach. That to me, I think, is a very sobering reminder for all of us in the security business. You don't have to be all the way compromised in order to lose a lot of value. But I also appreciate their disclosure and their approach to destigmatizing. We've said it before on this program, and many of our guests and the people, the practitioners who do this every single day, they remind us this is not a question of if you will be breached. It is a question of when your organization will be breached and how you react, how you respond, and how you move forward. In this case, hey, they were breached. They disclosed. They did not give in to the bad guys, and they are able to move on. In my estimation, that increases their credibility, not decreases their credibility, which is what everybody fears when we talk about, should we or shouldn't we disclose a breach that happens in our organization? So kudos to these guys. I think they've handled it effectively, but boy, it does remind us that nobody needs to actually get all the way into the inner sanctum to get valuable information. So let's revisit the layers and make sure we know what is stored where in all of our network environments.
And just to quickly follow up, Ryan, any thoughts also on the interesting attack vector here on the part of the adversary, going after an employee who hadn't even really technically started with the company yet, and somehow whether they managed to target this individual knowingly that they were associated with the company, whether it happened to be a happy opportunity, a crime of opportunity for them, but basically gaining access to Dragos through somebody who was just going through the onboarding process.
Yeah, that's a great point, because one of the lessons we relearn in this environment is just how creative the bad guys are. This is something that I think is surprisingly clever and almost guaranteed to be effective in very many environments, right? This happens to be an organization that lives and breathes this kind of security protocol. So when they were breached, they were able to identify and to mitigate. But imagine a scenario where somebody who has not yet begun working with your organization, does not know what the onboarding process will be, gets their credentials compromised before they even know that they were going to have credentials. That is a weak spot in our information systems that I haven't heard of that exposure or that exploit before, but that just reminds us, hey, if you have a system, it's going to be targeted and it's going to be vulnerable. So we have to always be thinking as creatively as the bad guys are.
All right, Ryan, very good sound advice as always. And we want to hear from you about this or anything else that we cover in the show. So please write to us at cyberforhire@cyberriskalliance.com. Anyway, that's going to be our top of mind hot take for the day. But now it's time for our featured InfoSec security strategy topic of the week, presenting our big idea in security, removing the BS from third-party assessments. Now, for this, we actually had an interview with a guest that we recorded separately a few days ago due to some scheduling conflicts. So we're going to throw to that interview shortly, and that's going to take us to the end of the first half of the episode. But then Ryan and I will be rejoining you at the very start of part 2. And so with that, we'll see you shortly, and we're going to throw it to the interview. Risk assessment questionnaires are a standard practice when evaluating current or prospective third-party partners. And yet some folks may justifiably ask, how valuable are these questionnaires if there are no consequences for fudging your answers or even outright lying? This session will examine common weaknesses and oversights in the third-party assessment process while recommending how to improve vendor transparency by obtaining key documentation, asking the right questions, and enforcing regulations. To discuss this further, we'd like to welcome in one of my favorite people in cybersecurity, someone who taught me a lot about the industry when I first started covering it as a writer, Merike Kaeo, Executive Security Advisor and vCISO at Double Shot Security, which provides corporate governance and executive strategies to secure global organizations. In prior roles, Merike held positions as CISO at Unifor, CTO of Farsight Security, and CISO for Internet Identity. She instigated and led the first security initiative for Cisco systems back in the mid-1990s, and she authored the first Cisco book on security, Designing Network Security. Merike, thanks so much for joining us. Always glad when we get a chance to talk. And as always, we're going to jump right into things. So first question for you, why is it your contention that there is a lot of BS in the third-party risk assessment process? What's fundamentally wrong with how it's typically done?
Thanks, Brad. Very happy to be here. And I think this is definitely a very important topic to discuss. Currently, many third-party risk assessments are still performed by answering a lot of questionnaires, which are mostly based on yes and no answers, which support the security controls and posture that an organization has. One very popular questionnaire that many organizations use is the one from the Cloud Security Alliance, which is called the Consensus Assessment Initiative Questionnaire, or known as the CAIQ. And the CAIQ is a questionnaire that covers over 200 questions to describe the security posture of what security controls exist, and they're mostly meant to pertain to cloud-based services. The problem is that many vendors will just say yes to many of the areas, even if they only have a security control for perhaps 10% of their environment. So you really have no real context as to what their actual security posture is. And then there's also the compliance certifications, which give you a somewhat better feel for an organizational security posture. And if you do meet compliance mandates, then you know that the organization has spent quite a bit of time on their security posture. But I've seen many environments where some security controls are misportrayed. And if the auditors are still new and are still learning, companies may have security certification compliance, but really not be as secure as a certification would attest to. So I see a lot of room in improvement in terms of how we actually do useful and informative and transparent third-party risk assessments.
All right, so there's a couple of ways that perhaps we can alleviate some of the problems around the answers that these third-party vendors are giving. I want to start with the more straightforward approach, which is the questions themselves. So Are organizations or the the MSSPs and the VCSOs conducting these assessments along with the auditor on behalf of these organizations? Are they asking the right questions in the first place, going off of some of these more standard questionnaires? Should their questions maybe be more pointed, more detailed, leaving less room for vagueness? And furthermore, should they require the vendor to back up their attestations with some kind of evidence or demonstration?
Yeah, there's a lot here, and there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. I think that one of the most fundamental aspects before you even start with any questions or trying to figure out what kind of context you need, I think that any organization needs to have a full understanding of whether or not they've had useful classification systems and handling procedures and processes for their corporate assets. So, any third-party vendor that you're going to be utilizing, you need to know whether or not it is public or insensitive data that they're going to have access to, or is it more restrictive and extremely sensitive data that if it is breached or compromised, would cause the organization to be either non-operational and business would cease, or it might create a material event. So obviously, the more sensitive the data, the more due diligence you would have to perform. So while we do have to have trust in this compliance certification process, at least there's some semblance of understanding that they have spent resources and time on their security posture. But I think that the questionnaire aspect really needs a whole reset. I think having vendors fill out hundreds of questionnaires with yes/no answers is honestly just a complete waste of time. But I do think that there's some value in questionnaires, but they absolutely need to be more context-driven than generic, where right now we're using kind of the one-size-fits-all for many environments. However, there's also the issue of a third-party vendor not wanting to give away some of their weaknesses, which could be exploited by someone. So, which questions are appropriate, what kind of added context is needed, I think is a value add that MSSPs can add to an organization's third-party risk management, because they can help the organization craft more context-specific questions, along with helping define what evidence is needed to have an organization make more informed risk decisions regarding a specific third-party vendor.
All right, so what kind of documentation might be available to review to then help supplement the questionnaires, which just by themselves you're saying is insufficient? So what can we do to basically provide more of that context that you're looking for? I know, for example, you had mentioned to me in a brief preliminary conversation that we had, Merike, that SOC reports may be a really good source to get a better idea of a third party partner's capabilities. I also might ask you, what about the idea of things like physical inspections or vulnerability scanning of certain vendors? Is that ever on the table as an option? I know sometimes they can be a little bit reluctant for something like that. So what about some of those options that I just presented to you?
Absolutely, thank you. And I think I do want to stress that some of these more stringent risk assessments really pertain to any third-party vendor that has access to any real sensitive data, right, in your environment. You would not be that stringent when you have insensitive data that a third party has access to. But it is true that many organizations ask for a third-party vendor SOC 2 report. The SOC 2 was designed by the American Institute of CPAs and defines the criteria for managing customer data based on 5 trust service principles: security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. And so these reports are very useful for an organization that goes through the SOC 2 process, because it gives a good feel for how effective you are within your controls, tools, and processes. However, if you give the SOC 2 reports away, let's say that you're the third-party vendor to an organization, it also contains information regarding weaknesses that could be exploited. So I have usually been of the mindset that I would not give out a SOC 2 report. So if I'm asking another vendor, to attest that they have good controls in place, I would typically ask for at least a SOC 3 report, right? Because I don't want them to put themselves at more risk of me having to see where their weaknesses are. However, I do want to know their weaknesses, right? So this really raises a very interesting conflict. As the organization assessing a third-party vendor, you want to have as much detail as possible. But if you are a third-party vendor to someone else, you do not want to expose all of your weaknesses. So how do we actually have a reasonable balance? Right? I mean, this is a question, and I think this is something that the industry overall needs to mature on. And there are, of course, also third-party vendor reports based on companies that do external scanning. And these may have a place, yet they often also have a lot of false positives, which again does not really give you an accurate answer. So in recent roles, I've had to spend hours dissecting reports and found it extremely inefficient. These are the reports done by third-party vendors that do scanning to try and ascertain an organization's security posture. So for myself, what I have usually done is just get on a call with the heads of security and assess how mature they are with their program. And of course, if you have thousands of third-party vendors, that's going to be a little bit difficult. But you do want to see where the data or your organization can be at most risk because of the sensitivity of the data that these third-party vendors have access to. And sometimes a 30-minute phone call with the heads of security is pretty good to assess how mature they are with their program, because we have to remember that no program is perfect, and there will always be a maturity that all organizations have to reach. But you at least want to assess that your third-party vendor is spending money and power and money and resources on their security program.
Yeah, certainly sometimes just getting on the phone with somebody and talking to them directly can be the most efficient way of getting some of the answers that you're looking for. So certainly that's, always advisable to do, and not just, leave it up to a simple standard, carbon copy form. Something else, Merike, that you had mentioned to me in our previous conversation that I thought was really interesting was almost the idea that even with some of these enhancements and best practices for doing some of these questionnaires, that process is still going to be imperfect, and you're not really necessarily going to capture all of the information you're looking for. So you are suggesting that you might even want to just take the posture of assuming that there are going to be some security lapses in some spots, and therefore you're more interested in finding out how robust they are in terms of their capabilities in incident response, because eventually something may happen. So I would be curious, what is your reason for placing such a high emphasis on incident response? Explain a little bit more about why that's your philosophy, that to you is actually maybe the most important area to learn about your third-party partners.
Absolutely, Brad. Over the last 5 to 10 years, I have really stressed incident response in either organizations that I've been a part of or the ones that I have been advising. Because with today's threat landscape, no matter how good your security processes and procedures, or how much money you're spending putting in effective controls, for nation state or organized crime attacks, if your organization is a focused target, then eventually there will be a vulnerability that gets exploited or a credential that gets stolen, or some other means that a threat actor will be successful in their attack. And so if I assume that at some point my organization may be a target, then my entire supply chain will also potentially be a target. And so I really care about how effective is their incident response in terms of processes and really overall how the organization handles incidences. And again, this is especially true if there is sensitive data that is being handled by a third party, and there's a high likelihood that they will be a target to instantiate either an intellectual property exfiltration or ransomware against the organization that I work for. And so some of the areas that I specifically look at is what was the most impactful incident that the third-party vendor has had in the last year, and how did they handle it? And again, this is somewhat sensitive to them as well. And so even when you're having a phone call, right, you want to make sure that you have the right people on the call, and not too many people either. You're just trying to assess, how they handle any kind of critical incident. And also, I would like to know whether or not they have 24/7 SOC coverage. And is it an internal team or outsourced? And if outsourced, how many staff members internal to the organization work with the SOC during a high severity incident? And this is especially true with some startups. I mean, there's some excellent startups out there that are really helping increase the agility and effectiveness of some services and processes. But being a startup, right, they may not have the security team in place and outsource. But everyone knows that, or you should know, that if you're outsourcing, that doesn't mean that the liability and all the processes and all the procedures are just within the SOC team, right? You have to have some internal resources that then work with the 24/7 SOC. So to me, it's important that an organization does have the processes, the people in place. People know who's in charge of incident handling and who has authority to do what. Because if in a short conversation, I ask some of these questions and there's immediate answers from the heads of security, I personally feel pretty comfortable that at least they have pretty good processes in place.
I really appreciate the fact that you were able to give some examples of some questions around incident response that you can ask your clients, third-party vendors, both a few sensitive questions, but important ones like how did you manage your last IR incident, which I think really obviously can provide some great insight, but also some ones that they should feel more comfortable answering, like having the 24/7 support. Because I think I was going to ask you, maybe what are some of your top recommendations for things to ask. So that was great. I do really want to make sure to also ask you. I had hinted a little bit earlier about legal liability. Just basically, I wanted to ask you around legal liability changes and increasing global regulations, and how this could potentially affect the third-party risk assessment process. I know you talked a little bit earlier about compliance, obviously, and looking to see how compliant an organization is to the various regulations that are out there is one way to be able to assess their capabilities. But of course, as we know, compliance doesn't mean fully secure. So I would be curious, based on the current legal landscape, regulatory landscape, how is that shaping the way third-party risk assessment can be done? How can you use that to your advantage?
Again, this is a very interesting topic surrounding just security maturity overall. Unfortunately, with so many threat actors at play, and many organizations who may not really have, they're trying to meet compliance mandates, and that is really their guideline for their security posture, rather than looking more at a foundational security program. And I think we see with all of these breaches where credentials get stolen, I mean, millions of credentials, and or all these successful ransomware attacks, that really we need to look at what are some of the root concerns and issues. So a lot of governments are looking at creating more stringent regulatory requirements. And one of these also has been around incident reporting. And I'm not sure that I can really say that this is going to improve third-party risk management overall. But I think that this is an area that certainly organizational leadership will look at more profusely or with more seriousness, because in some of these new laws that are coming out or regulations, it's actually the CEO or possibly even the board that will be held accountable if it is deemed that they have been negligible. And so I think there's going to be much more focus on what is the risks that a company has from a digital environment situation. And then how do we actually make sure that we have the information we need to do an appropriate risk assessment? So I think we're just starting to really look at how do we do better risk assessments for third-party vendors. There's a lot of discussion around this in CISO circles and other circles. I just recently was made aware of some insurance companies that they actually have their own scanning capabilities. And this was quite interesting to me, because they will actually help an organization themselves as they're getting insurance from this company. They will help scan the organization and work with the organization to then detect any kind of vulnerabilities that really should be, that they should pay attention to remediate. And I don't know how much this will then be leveraged to also be utilized with any third-party vendors. But I think it's a very interesting idea to have insurance vendors also help the organization to address and identify any critical vulnerabilities. And this might even then extend to third-party vendors.
All right. Well, America, I appreciate you answering my questionnaire that I have for you today, basically answering my interview questions. We have about 3 minutes left. So with that remaining time, I want to move on to a spooky little segment that we like to call What Scares You? The cybersecurity world, as we all know, is full of Chicken Littles out there, constantly warning us the sky is falling, when in reality, some threats are over-exaggerated. But then there are times when the danger is very real. So let's all gather around the campfire, you and me, Merike, and hear from you on what keeps you up at night, what gets your spidey senses tingling. And so, Merike, I ask you, what scares you?
The thing that I'm always most afraid of is that somebody is actually lying to me, right? Or they're not telling me the truth. Because if I'm in a security leadership role and if I need to make certain risk decisions, if I don't have the accurate and complete information, then I cannot make an informed risk decision. And sadly, I find that within the whole realm of cybersecurity, we have a lot of issues that still need to be addressed. One of them is the legal liability aspects, because often if you're transparent in terms of your actual maturity and maybe some weaknesses, then that will cause a regulatory liability issue, right? But it's really difficult to try and figure out, well, when are you actually doing the best you can, maturing over time, versus trying to pretend that you've got everything under control and you're really where you need to be. And one of the things that I want to call out is an initiative that has recently been made public. We had an RSA talk about it, which is the data-centric cyber maturity framework. And why yet another framework? Right? Because really at the center of what you're trying to protect is the data. And with this particular maturity model, the hope is also that it'll be much better and much more informed articulation of how you're actually maturing your cybersecurity, but with a data-centric focus. And so I do think that there's still a lot of work to be done from many angles: the policy perspective, the regulatory perspective, the legal liability perspective, because we have to get to a place where there can be more transparency in terms of what your actual security posture is. And especially if you're trying to hire third-party vendors that have access to very sensitive corporate information, right? But how you then portray that transparency, right? It's something that you can't just have in a report and send around in clear text email, right? Which some people do with SOC 2 reports, which I just, that scares me to no end as well. But, we really have to work on how do we get much better transparency, and how do we also make sure that the people that need to know get the information.
Yeah, transparency always, of course, very key. And of course, so is trust. But if you're being lied to, it's hard to trust. So I don't know, 30 seconds or less, solve this trust problem for us. What's the solution for gaining better trust with your ecosystem of partners? What's the best way to establish trust?
I wish the media would not overhype issues. Right. I mean, and cybercrime is crime. And so what I find is that so many either people on social media or the media always make the victim, be the problem. And so people are afraid to also be transparent. So I think it's much better if we try to at least be supportive, right, of individuals or organizations that have had issues and are trying their best to fix things, and really work more as a team rather than kind of going hey, we're better than you or whatever have you, right? Let's do it as a team amongst cross collaboration, and please let's stop hyping, these security issues. I mean, yes, some of them are serious, but the overhyping and shaming and blaming is, I think, not that effective either.
Understood, Merike. Well, I'm not lying to you when I say that you did a fantastic job today with this interview, and that I'm very happy that you were able to join us. And I'm sure we'll have you again sometime soon in one form or another. That's going to wrap up our first half of the show. Please return for the second half of our episode, featuring our big idea in business: pricing practices that fit the bill. That and more coming right up. So we'll see you in a moment on the other side.